Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church. Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered John 4, verses 16 through 30. Why did the Samaritans choose to worship at Mount Gerizim?
So Mount Gerizim occupies a place of significant prominence in the Old Testament. And we have to remember that the Samaritans share an ancestry with the Jewish people that really begins to split apart during the time of the exile, where most of the Jews are removed from the Promised Land, but those that remain, many of them ended up intermarrying and then assimilating with people who moved into the land, and in so doing, they syncretized the religion of Judaism with the religious and occult practices of the people that they were intermarrying with. And so that group of people who began to worship in some different ways than Orthodox Judaism were the Samaritans, these people who had intermarried, and therefore they were no longer pure Jews. They were no longer ethnically only connected to the family of Abraham. They now had intermarried with the other people of the land. But as a result of that, the Samaritans, one of their rather interesting religious practices is that they didn't recognize the canon of the whole Old Testament. They only recognized the canon of the Old Testament as being the first 5 books, the Torah. And so Mount Gerizim there in the Torah functions as the place where the blessings of the covenant are called out from, are spoken over the people of Israel. And so they recognize this place, this mountain, as the place where the blessings of covenant faithfulness were spoken over the people of Israel. And so as a result of that, from their understanding of Deuteronomy, as well as this Gerizim's prominence in the life of Abraham, particularly as building his life in the vicinity around Shechem, and then later Jacob, obviously, and Jacob's well being there, they understood this place, this mountain, as being the special place of God's blessing, covenant blessing with his people. So they felt that the Old Testament that they recognized contained only in the first 5 books pointed to Gerizim as the location where God was to be worshiped. And that Christ is really pointing out that their lack of understanding of the rest of the Old Testament, and particularly their lack of understanding of how David and Solomon bring forward Jerusalem as the central place of where God is to be recognized and worshipped among the people of Israel, in the temple that Solomon builds there, accounts for their failure to, in part, worship God in the wrong place, in the wrong way, and really they're worshiping a God that they do not know because of their syncretism with other occult beliefs.
In verse 22, Jesus almost seems to be saying that the Jews were ethnically superior to the Samaritans. Is that what he means?
So in verse 22, Jesus says to this woman, "You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." Now, that you there, you worship what you do not know, that is a second person plural. So he's not speaking now just to this woman. He's speaking to her as demonstrative of her people, as representative of Samaritan people. And so he's saying there that the Samaritans worship what they do not know, but in contrast, we, that is not Jesus and his disciples, but we as in the Jews. She's addressing him as a Jewish man. He's addressing her as a Samaritan woman. So it's the Jews and the Samaritans that form the we and the you in this text. You, the Samaritans, worship what you do not know. We, the Jews, worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. This sounds to our ears at first blush to be a statement of ethnic superiority. But really, it's a recognition that Jesus is forcing this woman to account with, that their understanding of divine revelation stops at the end of the Torah, when God continues to speak through the prophets and through the rest of the Old Testament. And so they'd closed themselves off to a huge swath of divine revelation of what is self-disclosure of God to his people. And as a result, their understanding of God was deficient, as well as the fact that they had incorporated false religious belief in with the Judaism that they had grown up with. And so their mixture and their really canceling off half of the Old Testament, or more than half the Old Testament, resulted in a stunted understanding of who God was, as well as the religious practices. But we shouldn't look at this as some sort of ethnic superiority, because Jesus is going to have plenty to say to the Jews about how they have corrupted and misunderstood the religion of the patriarchs, that they have lost the truth of worshiping God in spirit and in truth. He's just had this kind of encounter with a preeminent religious figure in Judaism in the person of Nicodemus, where he's rebuked them for not understanding true worship. And so what we have here is rather a statement from Jesus that contradicts this woman's understanding by telling her that the Samaritans have lost sight of who Yahweh is, while also saying that salvation, the oracles of God, the revelation of God, has been given to the Jewish people. And on account of this, the Jewish Messiah is going to be the one who brings salvation to the world. Salvation will be from the Jews to the world in fulfillment of the promises given to Abraham.
In the passage, Jesus makes multiple references to the coming hour. What is he referring to?
Throughout John's gospel, this terminology of the hour is a technical term that Jesus uses and that John records as being indicative of the incarnation and ministry of Christ that culminates climactically in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So the hour of which Jesus is speaking is this hour in redemptive history of his coming in the incarnation, and particularly the public unveiling of his ministry that culminates in his atonement for sin and his defeat over death and hell. And so in the context here of John 4, Jesus is saying that this discussion about the locality of where God is to be worshipped and which temple is superior to the other misses the whole point of what God is doing in the person of Christ, the Son that has now come. That God is doing something new, that Christ is God tabernacling among us so that he can make a new creation through the atonement of his own body and blood, and that therefore the temple itself is being made obsolete through this hour of his coming. Instead, the concern of those who truly want to be worshipers of God is how does God want to be worshiped? And that's how Jesus transitioned this woman's attention to considering what true worship is. True worshipers worship God in spirit and in truth. That is the kind of worship that the Father is seeking.
In verse 27, it says that the disciples marveled that Jesus was talking to a woman. This seems a little misogynistic. Why were they so surprised that Jesus was speaking to a woman?
I think it not only seems misogynistic, I think it points to an underlying misogyny within the culture, perhaps not even all that underlying. So if we look at the rabbinic traditions that exist, the commentary on the law, we need to recognize, one, these rabbinic commentaries are not inspired, so there's plenty of error in them. In fact, Jesus himself frequently rebukes the religious leaders for adding to the law of God so many of the traditions and commandments of men. And certainly the rabbinic commentary on the law and the rabbinic laws that exist outside of the canon of Scripture are those very sorts of things that Jesus is rebuking. And in those rabbinic commentaries and in those rabbinic laws, we find these comments about their understanding of the worth and value of women that really are shocking to read in comparison with how God speaks of his creation in the opening chapters of Genesis, for example. So one of the comments that you'll find in rabbinic literature is a recommendation that rabbis should not bother to speak to women outside of their own family because that is a waste of their time, and they should not bother to even teach their own wives or daughters the Torah because that would be a waste of their time to teach any woman, even their own flesh and blood or their own spouse, God's law, because their time would be better spent teaching only men. Well, this is, of course, really difficult to square with, one, how we understand women as being created in God's image, as we read in Genesis 1 and 2, the worth and dignity that God accounts to women throughout the Scriptures, clearly the worth and dignity that Jesus is accounting for to this woman particularly, but also even Deuteronomy 6, that we are to teach our children, male and female children, the things of God when we wake up, when we lie down, and are going out and are coming in. The rabbis had completely lost sight of that in order to maintain the misogyny of the time, which also allowed, for example, basically divorce for no reason, where if the wife didn't bake the bread in accordance with the husband's interests, that was a specific instance in rabbinic law that permitted divorce, that if the bread was burnt. And so we don't need to explain away the misogyny of the first century context in which we read the New Testament. Instead, we can see that over and over again, Jesus rejects the premise of this social setting that frames the understanding and the background of the disciples themselves. So this is a profoundly instructive moment to the disciples to learn that Jesus sees a woman, a Samaritan woman, an immoral Samaritan woman, as having worth and dignity and value commensurate with him actually revealing his own person and nature to her in a way that he has really yet to do in this gospel to many other people. And so if that's instructive to the disciples, it's also instructive to us that we need to have a high regard for God's image bearers as those that he sees as having worth, dignity, and value.
Could you expand on God's requirement to worship him in spirit and truth?
I think one of the themes that we see replete throughout Jesus' teaching in the New Testament is the rebuke that rings also through the prophets, that God detests worship that comes in forms and in rituals and traditions, but that is completely devoid of a heart that is actually alive to the things of God. These people worship me with their lips, but their mouths are far from me, is a refrain that echoes from the Old Testament into the ministry of Jesus to rebuke a people that has so much of the Old Testament memorized, recited. They're so consumed with keeping the law. And yet when God himself, in the person of Jesus Christ, shows up and is walking amongst them, they not only don't recognize him, but they explicitly reject his teaching, his instruction. So their understanding of God had gotten so far skewed that when God himself shows up, they reject him. Well, that helps us understand that the impetus that Jesus is putting to this woman about what true worshipers of God look like is being worshiping in spirit and in truth, communicates that, one, God must be truly known for who he is, that truth is important and imperative for worship. Not that we comprehensively know God, who is so far beyond our understanding, but what we know of God, we endeavor to understand truly, that we are not worshiping God in error and turning God into an idol. That's important. So God must be worshiped truly, not in an idolatrous fashion. But also this worship of God must come from our inner being. It must be part of a renewed inner man from the soul and from the heart. That is, again, not merely an intellectual exercise, but is in fact the transformative reality of a life that has been totally flipped over, turned inside out, renewed by the work of the Holy Spirit within us. That is the continual refrain of Christ throughout the Gospels. That's what true worship means.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.